So, welcome back to Be the Change podcast. Today, we have a special guest with us, Maria Murphy. Maria and I just became acquainted a little while ago when her coworker reached out and said, "You need to know Maria." I'm like, well, if you say I do, I guess I do. So, we had a fantastic chat, and Maria comes from a background in academia, shall we say, many years working in that realm. You have a lot of interesting and neat passions, which we'll get into. Mm-hmm. And I'm just so glad that you could join us today to have this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Stephanie. I'm pumped to be here.
Fantastic. Let's have a little look about, academia, some of the fantastic work that you've done in the US, and now you're back in Canada, back home again.
Yeah, sure. I always say, I was living in the US, primarily in Philadelphia, for the last almost 12 years, I think. Lived there from fall 2012 till summer 2023. Yes. So it's been just under 12 years, and finally got to move doing math live. I actually have a personal boundary against math, so I don't know why I did that to myself, but anyway, I can count a little bit. And we spent a lot of time in the US. My background primarily was in music, of all things. But when I started my PhD, got really interested in feminist theory and contemporary political philosophy, and ended up shifting a lot of my studies to gender and sexuality studies and media and communications. So after I finished my PhD, I worked at the University of Pennsylvania as the associate director of the Center, it's a long name, the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies, which was an incredible organization. And I loved working there, but basically was super homesick and had always had a dream of moving back to the Maritimes, and it worked out. But I did really enjoy my time in academia. I miss it a lot sometimes, but also there's some benefits of working in the private sector. As I mentioned, academia is in some ways like, government. There's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape. The inertia to affect change can feel insurmountable sometimes. And so, I think I mentioned in our pre-chat that, during my entire time at the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies, we were advocating to get all gender bathrooms in our building on our floor. And they have only just, since I've left, implemented the architectural plans to make that happen. So we had lots of Band-Aid fixes we would do. We put up a sign on one of the bathrooms outside of our office and just named it an all-gender bathroom. And, we had ways of moving the needle. But there was a lot of difficulties, and some that were surprising. One example that might be interesting to talk about is actually related to the onboarding practices of trans employees at the University of Pennsylvania. So I worked on this committee that was trying to make hiring practices and onboarding more inclusive. And what was interesting is that basically there was this law on the books that was initially supposed to support hiring women. So there's a federal reporting regulation in the states that requires institutions to report on how many men and women they have hired in their recent practices. And so, you can see how that data maybe was very helpful and meaningful at one point to make sure that women were getting hired in relation to in relation to men and being underrepresented in universities. But of course, when I was working on this committee, we were talking about actively trying to hire more trans people. And so then suddenly this mandatory reporting along the lines of sex, which according to the government was only male or female, suddenly we had this major problem. And it was interesting because when you're talking about federal regulation, you don't have as much leeway as you maybe would to, change something on a form or whatever, because this is legal information that has to be reported. Anyway, so this problem really informed how we were talking about hiring practices, and how you effect institutional change before you hire people, to make sure that folks who are going to be hired actually have a positive experience and that the institution is ready for them and not going to be making it up as you go along. Anyway, I didn't even have a successful major conclusion to the story, except that, we did add some extra onboarding language to ensure that what information got shared across the university would make sure that folks weren't misgendered, separate from whatever legal documentation they might have on their IDs. So it was an absurd amount of advocacy. We were able to improve the process marginally for new hires in terms of how that information was collected to lessen the harm of that mandatory reporting. But it wasn't really a perfect solution given those legal obligations. But it's an example of how difficult I found academic work to change policies around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, or whatever language or acronym folks are using. But I have found that in the private sector, at least primarily working with small and medium-sized businesses, that folks have more power to change their own internal processes, and so that has opened up some really amazing doors, I think, for leading the charge on how to make workplaces more inclusive. But academia was not the place for that fast change, unfortunately, at least in my small neck of the woods.
And I think that would probably be accurate in Canadian landscape too, when it comes to that, when you have big organizations that have historically been around and you're looking at binary, like just a binary of males and females, it's really dated, unfortunately. And I think going beyond that binary and having conversations, it's a good thing. But it does take time. And I think it's a lack of understanding, maybe fear, like all these things kind of interplay into it. And you're right. I think when we get into the SMEs, the small and medium sized enterprises, that I think organizations are truly open to, how do I be more inclusive? How do I have conversations? Because employment retention is a big thing that's on everyone's agendas of, like, we need folks, and we need in every different industry. And how do we get people through our doors, and what does that look like? So over your period of time, have you worked with, I guess, SMEs, and in what capacity? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I've actually been with this organization, Bloom Funding, only since the summer of 2023. But it's been really exciting to work with them on developing some of their sustainability initiatives. So, and under sustainability, we're talking about both social and environmental impact. So one of the offerings that we have that has been really exciting to develop is what we call New Metric, NU Metric. It's one of those unused Greek formulations that we took advantage of. But it is a metric we developed in partnership with an organization called the Decency Foundation, which is actually operates out of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And they first started working with small dairy farmers in New Jersey who were trying to integrate their verticals and, pursue regenerative farming practices. And the Decency Foundation worked with a number of small dairy farmers to develop a comprehensive metric to adopt circular economy principles, and basically make all of their operations more sustainable, but also more socially sustainable. So thinking about everything from compensation to what your involvement as a dairy farmer might be in your social networks, all that kind of thing. And it was they did some incredible work, and I was familiar with their work while I was living in Philadelphia. And when I moved back home to St. John, New Brunswick, I kept up that relationship, and we decided to partner with them to make this metric more widely applicable across a range of industries beyond farming, to also talk about primarily small and medium-sized businesses or small and medium-sized organizations. And so this metric is now widely applicable to think about everything from manufacturing and farming to professional services to teams that are hybrid or remote and don't really think that they have an environmental impact at all, but maybe aren't thinking about their digital footprint. And so it's been really inspiring to speak with so many small and medium-sized business owners who are really hungry to be part of some of these changes. And of course, there's a business case for that too. There's, like you mentioned, retention. Everyone's always talking about turnover, keeping employees engaged. And there is absolutely a business case for that work. From our research that we've been collecting, we have learned that belonging, a sense of belonging, is actually the leading indicator of well, this won't surprise you, Stephanie, but is the leading indicator of workplace engagement. And I do like having those types of stats available to me because people feel moved or persuaded by those business case arguments. But really, what I have found in my experience is that folks are quite just genuinely interested in having work be a place that is more relational and more decent, and allows people to bring their whole selves to their workplace. And yeah, what an advantage that is for a company, sure, but also just, isn't that the way we would like to engage with each other? Isn't that maybe a small step in some kind of collective liberation, depending on who I'm talking to? But I have absolutely found that, and especially in Atlantic Canada, there's such an investment in meaningful growth here. And I don't even just mean like economic growth, although I know that's obviously a concern as well, but just thinking about what this region means and what investing in this region and other small organizations can do for our collective well-being.
Wow. I'm stuck back a little bit on the dairy farm piece because I come from a community it's farming, actually. The community
I didn't know
live
that.
in the community that it's Gould's, Newfoundland and Labrador. So the community I grew up in, it's all based on agriculture and it's all based on farming. Of course, it's much bigger right now, but we have quite a few dairy farms in our community and farms in general. So it's plush land, and this is the time they're getting their last cut of the hay. And
That's right.
That's what was going on this weekend and all those things. So it's stuck back in there, and I was just like, oh, that's really cool, that's really neat. It's just like, and so for sure, like the whole belonging piece doesn't shock me. And some recent work and research that I've been diving into is all on psychological safety, and of course I'm taking, so it's that whole piece of setting the groundwork so folks can be safe. They can have those difficult conversations. For me as a queer person, I can put a picture of my wife and fur baby on my desk, right? Like, so I can show up for like who I am as a person and just bring that to work. So that's not on my mind. And, I'm not covering or masking or any of those sorts of things. So it's interesting how some of those are working, and I'm interested in learning, is there more statistics or things that you can share around, I guess, some of the great work you're doing and some of that piece?
Yes. Let me think. There are so many. I'm trying to think of maybe the next interesting angle. I mean, actually, I could probably pull a few up. So I could have had these ready to go, but
that's okay. But while you're doing that, and maybe this is something that you've dove into too, because I know through the benchmarking I've done, it's like looking at caregiver status and looking at some of the things organizations don't always look at. That I found that with the benchmarking is like sometimes somewhere around 50% of folks, or maybe even more in organizations, are caregivers to young people or to adults. So it's just looking at how that impacts workplaces.
Oh yeah, like the labor of care or domestic care work and figuring out. I mean, I think there was a lot of improvement in terms of just public understanding, especially in the wake of COVID and how caregiving took such another stressful contour. Or deeper levels as folks were negotiating not being able to take care of loved ones or aging parents, or just the way we think about childcare and work relations when folks were suddenly teachers in their own home and working while also babysitting their own kids. I mean, it was a wild time, and I don't know that we've fully done the full reckoning that we could and should do on that front. But I will absolutely say, again, the types of small benefits that small businesses can provide, like flex time and hybrid schedules, especially if you are working in professional services, those types of policies are expected at this point, which I think is good. The fact that workers want to see some alignment between their own personal values and possibly some kind of stated values of the company they work for is increasingly important. And also from clients and customers, just to point out some of these stats I just pulled back up from some of our research, sustainability, whether that's social or environmental, is increasingly important and top of mind. I mean, customers and consumers and clients are really changing their consumer patterns, their buying patterns, where sustainability is important. There was one roundup poll from 2023 that said 78% of consumers are factoring in sustainability into their decisions on whether or not to work with a company. Something like
that's massive.
Yeah, no, it's
that's
huge.
Massive, right? And no doubt generationally, this is playing into it too, like younger generations, because I know my parents, they literally worked in the one workplace almost all their whole lives. Like they weren't shifting, looking for, another place to work. They went to work in the same place and they retired from the place or maybe a second place, but it's not generationally. I think when you start looking at it, it's going to look completely different.
Oh yeah, we're finding that too. That, if you go from even generation, even from millennials to Gen Z, those numbers are increasing. There was another poll, there was a Randstad study in 2024. It was called the Global Study on Workers. And they were talking about the percentage of young people who would not accept a job if the business didn't align with their social and environmental values. And that was 38%. Yeah. So, and not that any of us under capitalism are necessarily like, yes, my company is where I think about where my values are most keenly expressed. And yet it's like, okay, where do we have some agency within the systems of which we are conscripted into, or voluntarily part of? But absolutely, that number goes up with younger generations. And what was another stat? 37% wouldn't accept the job if the organization wasn't making a proactive effort to improve its diversity and equity. And again, those are really general categories and mean different things to different people. But I think what we can glean from this poll or this study is that, these figures are growing. And workers or employees are increasingly invested in spending their time at an organization that has some alignment with who they are or what they care about. And again, so there's a huge business case for that. There was a Gallup poll that showed that businesses with engaged workers, and again, we know that belonging is one of the leading indicators of engagement, that businesses with engaged workers have a 23% higher profit compared with business units with miserable workers. So again, there's that business case. It's not to water down the politics of this with a win-win situation type of outlook, but I do think that here we have one of those opportunities where the business case and the social impact actually align, and we should really run with that as much as we possibly can.
Absolutely. And I think that some of the organizations that I've worked in the past with on benchmarking, they've never benchmarked some of these things before because they didn't see how important it is for their people. They didn't see how important it is for their clients, their customers. They had no idea. So like if we have no idea around our customer base per se, like who they are or who internally our clients are, because like you want your inward customer base to be like your community facing, you want it to look similar. You want it to be up on everything that's going on within your local ecosystem. And you really need to be having a look at benchmarking and knowing who is it, like measuring, like who's in our organization, what's important to them, like asking some of these questions. And a lot of organizations don't ask some of these things because I think they're afraid of asking it. Am I allowed to ask about people's
Right.
gender identities? Can I ask around caregiver status and some of these things? And I'm like, well, we need to be asking because like we need to normalize where people are and we need to get information from them so you can do better on your policies, your procedures, like, everything from how we're treating people, the niceties that we're doing,
Mm-hmm.
how we're doing rewards, like how we're doing, praise, like, and all these, vital components that I think we've seemed to be missing for some reason. The humanity piece has been stripped back a bit. So like just benchmarking, who's in our organization, like what are they feeling? Are they engaged? Right? Because when, like you said, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism is involved in organizations, they're actually 50% more employee engagement. Now that's like boom, mic drop. Like, so why wouldn't we
Yeah.
do these things? Right? So
No, it's so true. And I mean, I love your point about just asking the questions. I think approaching, these types of issues with curiosity and goodwill and a genuine desire to do right by your coworkers and your employees is key and is actually a really wonderful place to start, just asking questions. I mean, that's often what we talk about with some of the small and medium-sized businesses we're talking to is just implementing is it a quarterly or even annual employee survey?
mhm.
What are the types of things that you're tracking? Are you asking employees how they like to be recognized, or what are they really missing, or what types of supports might they need? Just asking those questions goes such a long way, and then making sure that there's communication on the movement of those initiatives, whether there's movement or not. Communicating
Yes.
is so key to building that trust and to also recognizing, that that type of knowledge base should be leveraged as much as possible.
Is the transparency, because what you find is it's great. Wow, we got our engagement survey done. The numbers were great, or they were whatever. And there's nothing. It's dead silence.
Mm,
Nothing gets communicated out to the people that did them. And then what happens when another survey comes out? People are like, well, I know nothing about the last one, so why should I complete this one? So, like, why
totally.
not throw out your top three numbers, your bottom three numbers, and more importantly, what are you going to do about them? Like, what are you going to do to increase engagement? What are you going to do to get to the, because there are going to be three numbers in the bottom, whatever they are,
Hmm.
that the organization, because not every organization is doing things, and we're not going to do things completely correct and perfect. Like, perfection doesn't exist. So, how can we move that needle, I guess, ahead when it comes to, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, or like whatever it is, that engagement, those numbers that you're looking at within the organization?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, for me, from what we're finding is that the worst possible outcome from that kind of thing is just no communication.
Mm.
And that if someone on your team makes a suggestion and you don't take it, it's going to be far worse if you don't communicate that you're not taking that suggestion, rather than even just anything else. Like it's really just about closing that loop and that folks can feel at least like or opinions or ideas were taken into account, even if they can't be implemented right away. But just letting folks know where that stands. And then, picking one or two. I mean, I always say small, meaningful movement. We have a practice where we help folks write their social responsibility commitments that they can share if they want to, or it could be an internal document. And we at Bloom Funding have one as well. And they are our small interventions. I mean, they are not like, we have big dreams of the impact that we want to have, but what we really want to communicate is what we are holding each other accountable for and the small steps that are actionable and going to have a material impact. And those are the types of things that we communicate, even just on our website to let folks know, here are some of the things we're trying to do around employee well-being or, around truth and reconciliation. Here are just the small things we're working on, just to show that those types of interventions in a collective, meaningful way start to add up for really big impact.
Absolutely. And you're right. It is the small, meaningful steps, but they're intentional. Like that's the word I
Mm-hmm.
use a lot. It's
Right.
like we're being intentional around the things that we're doing. We're learning, we're improving, we're going to make mistakes. This space is not perfect. And I keep saying that because it's not. And I think people are afraid to make a mistake in the space. So now they're not doing anything for that reason. And one helpful hint I always say is put it on your agendas every time you meet as a management team or as a team.
Right.
Have those moments. I worked in healthcare. We had safety moments every single morning when we met. So why not have your diversity moment or diversity inclusion or whatever you want to call it? Like have those moments so people can share. And even if, I mean, there's so many things you can share. There's so many things that are part of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, anti-racism. There's just like small videos, just small wins, books. Like there's so many things. Any thoughts on some of those?
Yeah, I mean, getting things on the books and just making some basic policies to spend time addressing or even thinking or beginning to work on it. I think that's such a huge and a really good example of ways that organizations, especially if they don't know where to start. I mean, when we talk about ESG indicators and, new metric is informed by many existing ESG indicators and beyond. But, that governance piece is really important. If you are trying to cultivate a workplace culture that is inclusive, what are the actual policies and practices that are built into your strategic planning that are actually outlined, that are on paper somewhere, and they don't just sit in your Google Drive. They are discussed at least, once per quarter, or, if there's a biannual town hall or whatever it is, where those issues are getting some airtime. And I think, again, for us with developing new metric, we are really deeply invested in meeting organizations where they're at. Excuse me, sorry. We really want to, start where it makes sense to start. And that is a key solution that, I think it's really insightful, Stephanie. It's just making specific time to begin addressing these, some of these practices or policies and building them into just directly into your strategic planning or your annual calendar. For us, one tiny thing that we encourage folks to track is how much vacation time is being used. So sometimes you go on a website and this isn't necessarily an inclusion specific policy, but it kind of can be, because depending on how the demographics of vacation use pan out, you might start to see some interesting trends, which is who feels entitled to actually make use of that vacation time and who may not. So there are tiny little things like that just to start tracking. If you give everyone 3 weeks, is everyone using their 3 weeks? And then are there any additional incentives to help people use those 3 weeks? I mean, a tiny solution that we do internally on our team is you get your birthday off. It's just an extra PTO day. And if it's on a weekend, you can take either the previous Friday or the next Monday off. And it's like almost like mandatory. I mean, another stat that we have researched is basically if you're waiting for employees to be burnt out, it's going to take so much more time and effort to reacclimate them to the workforce. And that if you are actually incentivizing or, strongly suggesting that folks are taking breaks throughout the year and using that vacation time, that is going to be better for them. And it's going to be better for an organization that it's so much harder to come back from burnout. So, a tiny thing like a birthday, PTO day, which is meant to be taken around your birthday, on your birthday before or right before after if it's a weekend. For us anyway, that's we're a Monday to Friday type of organization, but there's lots of other schedules out there that there's ways that you can implement these tiny policies that make sure that employee well-being is being factored in regularly. And it's a given practice. It's not something that you have to ask permission for because it's an outlined policy. And, the best team members or managers or bosses are the ones who are going to remind you to take advantage or insist to take advantage of those types of policies.
Love that. Love that. Haven't heard of a lot of organizations implementing that one, but I do really like that.
It's small. It's easy.
Yeah,
it doesn't add cost. It's an easy one.
I always try to take my birthday off. Actually, that's one of the things I try to do is just like, it's kind of that special day that, I do whatever I want to do. Like, what I mean? Within, limits, of course, like whatever that is.
Yeah, sure.
Just kind of celebrating who we are, getting to have that special supper or just walk or whatever that is out in nature. It's like whatever kind of fills your cup. Because you're right. Like 1 in 3 of us have mental health difficulties. So burnout, sometimes it strikes. I've had it in my career. It struck and I've been off work for months. It's just like, okay, I can't function anymore with everything that's going on. So just to get to recognize that before it happens is massive. And just being able to implement, I think you're right, those small strategies are very, very much so needed within the organization.
Yeah.
Awesome. So if people want to connect in with you, we're going to end this piece of our podcast here. We're going to start another one shortly. So if people want to connect with you and have further discussions and see what you're up to and how you're doing, what's the best?
Yeah, you can check out our website, bloomfunding.ca, where you can write to me, Maria, at bloomfunding.ca. And I would love to hear from you, especially if you're engaged in, thinking about, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiatives, especially as they contribute to employee well-being. That's my bread and butter these days. So I would love to have a conversation with folks who are also working on those issues.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today.